The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in today. My name is Agnes Harper, and I'm a project facilitator for the Southern Universities Network. Before I hand over to our presenter today, Professor Bill Lucas, I just wanted to run through a couple of things. First of all, a really quick sound check. If you're able to hear me, if you could please type yes into the questions and comments box, that would be great. I'm just going to wait a couple of seconds just to confirm that the technology is working, and it seems like it does. Thank you very much for people who replied yes. So to start with, I just wanted to give you a brief background information about the Southern Universities Network. We are a partnership of 6 universities, and we are part of the Uni Connect Programme, formerly known as the National Collaborative Outreach Programme, funded by the OFS. Our main aims are to reduce the gap in all forms of higher education participation between the most and least represented groups, and to support young people make well-informed decisions about their future. Our webinars are part of the staff CPD aspect of our programme to help you better be able to support and advise your students. As for the format of the webinar, it is recorded, so in a few days' time you're going to receive a link to the recording in an email, so you can listen to it later, and you can also share it with your colleagues. After the presentation, we're going to have a brief question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them at any point during the webinar. And when Bill has finished his presentation, I'm just going to pass your questions on to him. And then finally, we are going to finish just with a few short evaluation polls before 5 o'clock. Please, if I can ask you to stay right until the end, obviously your feedback is really important to us. So if you could stay until 5 o'clock and participate in the evaluation polls, that would be brilliant. So at this point, I am going to hand over to Bill.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to get my presentation up and running and get the display so that you can see all of that. So I'm hoping that's working, and I'm sure that somebody will tell me if it's not. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and my subject is developing student creativity. I'm thinking mainly about schools and colleges, but I'm also thinking about outside life, lifelong learning, and that seems very relevant right now. I'm in a house in lockdown, like many of you, with 2 15-year-olds who had been going to do their GCSEs. So as you can imagine, my creativity is being, I hope, well used. My frame is to start with a description of what I think we can say creativity is, to make a case to you that it matters. It matters in a whole range of different ways. It matters for our students, for us as adults, for our future career progression, for our well-being, all sorts of things. I'm going to talk about how schools, but it could be colleges, can cultivate it, and just leave you with a sort of call to action. I'm based at the Centre for Real World Learning at the University of Winchester. The slide you can see is not my office, it's the university's student building. We're up on the Romsey Road on the West Downs campus. That's my Twitter handle @LucasLearn if you want to talk in other ways to me or about creativity outside this session. The logo you can see on the right-hand side of your screen above the universities is the Commono Foundation, a charitable body interested in creativity and practical learning who fund our work. And the little EdNet circle is our logo for the Expansive Education Network. This is a network of teachers and others interested in their own research, action research, asking and answering questions and making small tests of change in their practice, predominantly in schools, but also in colleges. So let's start. I'm a trained teacher. I now am a professor of learning at the university. In between, I've set up and run various social enterprises. Learning Through Landscapes, the Campaign for Learning are just two examples. So I'd like to think that creativity is in my DNA. I'm a prolific writer, and I'll show you a few pictures of some of the things that I've written. In fact, I'll show you right now. Here are just a few of them, starting with a work way back 20 years ago, Creativity in Education, right up to the most recent book with my colleague Ellen Spencer, Zest for Learning. That's how you can introduce that concept of zest in school by working with bodies outside school. And the book I'll be concentrating, or whose ideas I'll be sharing most, is this one here, Teaching Creative Thinking. Of course, in this period of enforced additional time for reading, you'd be very welcome to get your own copy. This is the shape of what I'm going to be talking about. As I said, starting with what creativity is, then why it matters, probably most importantly, how to do something about it, cultivate it, what we can all do right now, and the next steps, which will be a mini conversation here together, orchestrated right now before 5 o'clock. So let's begin with the first of these. What is creativity? Well, our model of creativity draws together a number of strands of thinking, really, which go back 70 years. I'll come on to that in a second. At the top of this model, you can see two key words, imagination, or imaginative, and inquisitive. And these, for many people, are at the heart of what it is to be creative. They suggest our ability to have ideas and our ability to ask good questions. Divergent, if you like, and convergent thinking. We've added three other key creative habits of mind. And these are about being persistent, keeping going, because almost inevitably, as a creative, it requires you to think outside the box, to be, if you like, dare to be different. It's also collaborative. Very rarely is creativity a solo endeavor, and it requires discipline. I think it's a myth that's been unhelpful, but you are kind of born creative. And in fact, we know there's very strong evidence that we can all become more creative. So that's our 5-dimensional model of creativity. On the left, you'll see a paper for the OECD, which has been very influential for us and in our thinking about this, because it brought this model to the awareness of the OECD and has led indirectly to my role now as co-chair of the new PISA test in 2021 of creative thinking. So that's our model, but of course, we're just one of a number of thinkers, and one of the individuals on whose shoulders we stand is J.P. Guilford, arguably the father of this discipline. 70 years ago, roughly, give or take, he introduced the idea that creativity was about these 4 things: the ability to have lots of good ideas, the ability to think differently, flexibly, the quality of the originality, the novelty of your ideas, and the degree to which you could develop them, elaborate them. Fast forward by 50 years, so we're now in 2020, and if you're in English or British education, you may well be familiar with the Ken Robinson report, so-called, where his definition of creativity was the one you can see there on the screen. And for some teachers, it was a revelation, it was very exciting, and for others, it was slightly terrifying, because it suggested that we were ourselves original and we would know when something had value. For many, it was a standard bearer of what might be possible in schools. In the PISA test in 2021, we've defined creative thinking again, as you can see on the screen. And you'll see, I hope, that there's a direct connection and read across with the work that we've been doing at the University of Winchester here. You can also see it's a rather long definition, and that's the nature of working collaboratively with colleagues in an organisation like PISA. Lots of different ideas and inevitably not quite the succinctness that you might otherwise have. Last year, the Durham Commission reported on creativity in education. And if you haven't managed to see this, it's free to air. Do download it, and I hope you might find it interesting. It has 3 key definitions. Again, I won't read them out to you because you can read for yourself. But the first on creativity is very simple and rather elegant, I think. Importantly, for the first time, creative thinking. Again, you can see how it draws on, and I was privileged to be part of this commission, how it draws on the thinking we've been doing at the university. And then at the bottom, really where we're going to be talking today, teaching for creativity. What is it that schools and colleges and others can do explicitly to use pedagogies and practices that cultivate creativity in young people? Talking of young people, here's the back of a 6th former at Thomas Tallis School in South London. Thomas Tallis School, one of the schools that we've worked very closely with over the years. And my great excitement was to be at that school in their art room as it happened, although it could have been any subject because creativity is not uniquely allied to one, and certainly not just the arts. I discovered from talking to these students that they'd recently decided that they would have a school competition to decide what their new hoodies would look like. And those who wanted to see these words on them won out. And now wherever you go, you can see our 5 creative habits of mind on the backs and the fronts of the hoodies of the students who were working with us as they showed us the work they were doing in various different subjects. The model's not just confined to South London. Here it is in South Sydney, in the southwestern suburbs of Sydney, a wonderful high school, Rooty Hill High School. And you can see there on the wall of the back of that's their library actually, where Zane, this is a secondary school, high school, Zane, a student I've had the pleasure to meet over the 5 years or so I've been working with them. So there's just a starter for 10, what creativity is. And it's definable, it's multidimensional, it's not a simplistic idea, but like any good thing in life, like science, like geography, like history, like many of the disciplines that we take for granted as defined in schools, so too with creativity. It's clear enough, I think. I think, and my friend and colleague Guy Claxton thinks too, that we need more students who are more creative and probably have some of these other attributes too. A little while ago, we imagined what Rita, as in the film and play Educating Rita, if she had a granddaughter, might think. And we imagined her having a granddaughter called Ruby, and that Ruby was in a school near you. And we then imagined all the different capabilities and attributes that Ruby might have. You'll see that creativity is one of them. And you can see rather unsubtly that I've color-coded all those that very obviously relate to creativity, like collaboration and curiosity, are in the orange of Teach Creative Thinking, and those that relate to being persistent, although there's that's an element of creativity, are coded in the purple color linked to tenacity. Now, it's not just an imaginary Educating Rita saying this, or 2 authors promulgating their views. Here's the World Economic Forum. So if you're sitting here listening or watching and your role in school is about careers or employment, then it's a very strong argument to me that for the last 3 or 4 years, the World Economic Forum has described creativity right up there as its one of its top in demand competencies, often linked to critical thinking, often linked to collaboration and to communication. You can see that particular model has a set of foundational literacies, the subjects of the school curriculum, if you like, and a set of competencies and a set of character qualities. There are lots of different ways in which we can describe this. Closer to home here in London, the Institute of Education, here's a nice piece of work by two educational researchers listing creativity as one of what they call non-cognitive skills, skills that are going to help young people have better outcomes in their life. A very important aspiration for the Sun Group, under whose banner I'm sailing this afternoon. I do a lot of work in Australia, and across the world there are a number of different approaches to this. Australia's is really interesting. Australia's has a cube, if you like, describing their curriculum. The subjects of the school curriculum on the vertical axis, then the phrases like critical and creative thinking and personal and social capability along the horizontal-ish axis, and then some key themes like sustainability at the top of their cube. Hold that image in your mind, because it's rather important when we think about how to embed creativity in schools. If you moved out of Australia and headed north to Singapore, or moved out into the Asia Pacific area, you'll see that many of the national curricula of schools have words like creativity, or critical and inventive thinking, or critical and innovative thinking if you're in the Asia Pacific area of the world. Closer to home, and quite recently, Wales has come up with a new curriculum, which comes into force, I think, in a year's time. And stage centre in this new curriculum is the idea of creating enterprising, creative contributors who connect and apply their knowledge and skills to create ideas, to think creatively, and so forth. And that's exciting. And Scotland too has been blazing a trail in this area with their curriculum for excellence. And I'd just like to think that finally, eventually, with a little nudge from the Durham Commission, we might get there in England. We're not there yet. If you were to travel round, if only we can, and only in imagination today, the world, here you'd see a Spanish version of that model of ours I've been showing you, being used in a small school, bottom left of your screen there, in Chile, in a little township called Frutillar, and a workshop above in the local theatre there, which I was leading. Here we're in another Southern Hemisphere environment. We're in a primary school in Perth in Western Australia, and children, quite small children, are using the model that we've developed to talk about their learning. So if you like, in a sort of visible thinking way, describing the processes of what's going on for them. You can see they've been building a highly creative way of getting some object down a chute out in the playground, and now they're reflecting on the process of what they've been doing. If you're interested, that model is now very widely used across the world, often working with our friends at Creativity, Culture and Education. Each of those blue blobs is an indication of where there's some activity. But it's not just us. This is a global movement. The Brookings Institution in Washington in the US have noticed that increasingly in national curricula, skills related to creativity are being identified. They're beginning to appear in curricula, and in a small number, 11, in a small number of countries, the end-to-end continuum of creativity is specified. So you have a progression of what it's like to be creative age 5 right through to being age 18. And here's that Durham Commission report I mentioned. And on the left of your screen, a really important piece of work, again, which you can download, the OECD's Fostering Students' Creativity and Critical Thinking research. And this research worked across 11 countries over 4 years and asked the question, how can you embed creativity, and even can you assess it? To which the answer is, there are lots of ways of embedding it, and yes, you can assess it, but of course it depends on the purposes of your assessment. Now, there are some places, well, one in particular, where assessing creativity is already happening. Here we are in the state of Victoria, where to my knowledge, the first set of creative thinking assessments is now being used. These are Australians, 15-year-olds in the state of Victoria, that's to say the state that has Melbourne in it, who are being assessed on the development of their creativity as part of their national curriculum. And as you heard from me earlier on, in 2021, PISA will also be assessing creative thinking. And we'll be looking at it in its verbal and written forms, in its visual forms. We'll be locating it perhaps counterintuitively in science or maths, and also when we say social or interpersonal, we frankly mean common sense in the real world. If it were located just in subjects, it would become a proxy for how good you were in a subject. I, as you know, because I've told you, work a lot in Rooty Hill High School in Sydney, and I work so much there that they've made my own learning hub. You'll see it says, "Hi Bill, click here to add evidence." And this is a really simple mechanism which I think schools and colleges will be using increasingly, maybe yours does, where you use a portfolio, an electronic portfolio, to upload evidence of your development. Assessment very much being seen here as assessment for learning. Assessment for me is the mechanism by which we work out whether we're getting ahead in the direction we want to go. It's not about testing, ironically, in the way that PISA uses it, but that's it for another day. There are lots of different ways in which you can assess capabilities like creativity, and here are just some of them. This is a page from the book I showed you earlier on if you're interested, Teaching Creative Thinking. So we've had a little run around what creativity is, some thinking about why it matters. Now let's turn to, so how might you cultivate it in a school or college? Well, we have a challenge immediately, don't we? If we just take a secondary Year 7 curriculum, a rather colourful one and a rather stereotypical one and possibly a bit predictable, but not a million miles away, I suggest, from many school curricula. And of course, the immediate challenge is that the word creativity doesn't appear, because life in school is framed by subjects, by disciplines, by literacy, by religious education, by drama, and so forth. Nothing wrong with that, but it does mean that we need to think creatively to get creativity on the timetable. And in the next few slides, I want to share our own research on how best we might do this, what we're learning about it, and some wonderful schools we've been working with, two of which I've already alluded to, on which I'm basing this, these suggestions for you. From the OECD research, we concluded that it is possible to do this at primary and secondary level, but that it works well when we are intentional. So not just leaving it to accident or saying it's all about osmosis or assuming it will happen. When we explicitly embed it, so we come up with schemes of work and projects and programs which enable it to flourish. It also requires professional learning because some teachers are uncertain. It takes time, and there are lots of different ways of doing it. Hooray. So there's no one monochromatic answer. Some teachers, even those very passionate about this, kind of assume that it just happens. If you like, it's a miracle. We know we want our students to be creative. That's that, all those hieroglyphics on the right of the blackboard. And exactly how it happens, well, it kind of just does. I'm a very creative teacher. And there are indeed very creative teachers, but I don't think that's enough. And I don't think most people these days do. So here is a cyclical process, a 4-step model of embedding creativity in the curriculum. It's the work of my colleague Ellen Spencer and myself. And the first step one is really what we've been doing together. It's developing a real understanding of creativity. The second is, and I'll come on to this in a second, establishing the climate. I've said here the classroom climate, but it's a bit more than that because we need to think beyond the classroom to the informal curriculum, and we need to think about the culture of the place, whether creativity is as valued as we'd like to think it is, And then we need to think step 3 about the kind of pedagogies we'll use, and step 4, not leaving them to last, but we really need to have learner engagement in this, and that might be through the extracurriculum, or it might be very, very actively within our classroom modeling and teaching. The second of those, let's just flip back, the second of those 4 steps was all about classroom climate, and I want to think just for a moment about culture. Bear in mind, step 1 is really what I've been talking about thus far on this talk. I think there are a number of ways, number of principles, if you like, in which we might think about creating a culture that's conducive to creativity, what I've called here a creative learning ecosystem. The first and the last, in many ways, are the most important, but we're much more interested in questions than we are in any one right answer. It's interesting in my work with PISA, what we've discovered from our work in framing assessment tasks is that the best assessment tasks, those which differentiate well and allow learners to show how much they're achieving, are those which can be answered at many different levels and often have no one right answer. The second and most important of these, I think, is the last, number 10. It's a very organized world, the world of school and college, isn't it? Not just the school timetable, the bell goes, students file in and then they file out when the bell goes again, just perhaps as they were getting interested. These 10 principles are something that you might like to take away. I find them interesting when I'm running professional learning sessions with teachers by using them as a simple self-report activity for staff members to ask and answer the question, so how often do these things happen in our school? So you might like to just think for a moment. I'm going to pause and give you some thinking time. How often do you ever? So let's think. So let's take the last one. This I leave space for the unexpected. No, I don't. Or sometimes I do, or mostly I do, or yes, I really do, and genuinely do, and so forth. So a simple 4-stage Likert scale there, which you might like to use as a stock-taking activity to see how your own school is on its cultural journey. I'll just leave you to look at that for 1 second. Okay, and moving on to 3 key approaches within that overarching framework of an ecosystem that's hospitable to creativity that I want to share with you now. The first is split screen teaching. Think of that model of the cube that we had earlier on from Australia, where you had a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. And the vertical axis was the subjects and the horizontal axis was critical and creative thinking embedding itself in that. Just hang on to that model. Visible thinking, an idea from Harvard in the States, and signature pedagogies I'll explain in a second. Let's start with split screen thinking. The idea of the split screen metaphor, or indeed the 2 sides of the cube, is that we need to think about not either or, but and. We need to think about the knowledge element and the creativity element. So today, if I'm in a history lesson in secondary, I'm thinking about the causes of the Second World War, for example. That's one side of my screen called history. And on the other, I'm using part of my imaginative, creative brain to think about just what it must have been like when the war started. If you were in all of the countries that eventually ended up being in the war, and perhaps imagining a day in the life of that very early stage of the war. Or if you wanted to take a scientific example involving, say, collaboration, today we're going to be looking at acids and bases. That's the split bit of the screen, and in the screen bit of the split screen, we're going to be looking at creative ways of working in groups to solve and to set up an experiment where we don't know the answer. We're going to have to notice very carefully. We're going to have to work very intuitively and imaginatively to see if we can notice whatever's happening in whatever experiment we're doing. The second of these 3 ideas is making it routine and visible. So it's visible thinking. Look at the core routines there. What makes you say that? Think, puzzle, explore. Think, pair, share. I used to think, now I think. This is thinking from Project Zero, Harvard's think tank. Really powerful ways of making creative thinking normal in a classroom. If some teachers find it too vague, I'm tempted to say, well, think, pair, share is pretty precise. And if we get used to that, then it becomes a way of being in a classroom, as is see, think, wonder, if you want to encourage that aspect of creative thinking. And the third of these three is choosing the right teaching and learning methods, taking an idea from Lee Schulman of signature pedagogies, the teaching and learning methods that are most applicable to the development or the cultivation of creativity in young people. We've gone a little further here, and in the Teaching Creative Thinking book, Ellen and I have mapped out against each of the 5 creative habits of mind what you might be thinking about. So if you're trying to develop inquisitive learners, it might be a clutch of teaching and learning methods around problem-based learning. If you're trying to encourage imaginative children and young people, then you're going to want to probably be playful yourself, and so forth. I won't read those out to you, but you'll see that this is quite nuanced. It's not just saying have one of those and one of those. Each of these maps on and matches to different aspects of creativity, such that if a passing Ofsted inspector were curious about your ability to map your intention, how it's implemented and its impact, you might have a really good answer for her or for him. At the coffee time chat in the staff room level, the kind of language you might be using with colleagues would be in these kinds of teaching and learning methods. Again, I'll just give you a moment to read down that list. Of course, it's not just about the formal curriculum. We're very pleased to be working with the Royal Yachting Association, and if you see at the bottom of that screen, I'll just highlight it in red, a number of attributes that you'll also perhaps see if you're interested in the Educating Ruby book I showed you earlier on. These attributes, albeit 6, not 7, very similar to the kind of 7 C's that we had given Ruby. And you can see creativity and communication and competence being in that list. When you're learning to sail, doing things for the first time, having to think on your feet or maybe your knees in this image, or your bottom if you're helming, all sorts of very real-time opportunities to think creatively. And if you think now about your school or your college or your context more broadly, you're working with educational organizations, then very, very many opportunities to develop young people's creativity in the sports field, in the drama studio, in science activities, engineering activities, community service activities. Really, there's no limit, and we outline a lot of these in our book, Zest for Learning. So I've talked a little about what creativity is, why it matters, and what you might like to do about it. So what might you do tomorrow? Where might we go with this? If you've liked anything you've been hearing, what next? Well, let me suggest 3 particular things, but before I do so, let me just reflect that we're in the most extraordinary period of our lives at the moment. I think I can say that with confidence. If ever creativity were needed, surely it is today, isn't it? So many new situations where we're having to think around something, think underneath something, think very, very different. I mean, I was astonished, I'm sure you would have been, by the early flourishing of creativity from those who used to make racing cars now making ventilators, or the kind of global movement in creativity in design your own face masks, whatever your view of those items of protective clothing are, and so forth. And I just wondered, as we're all sitting here in our different spaces, whether, as well as with your educational hat on, you may care to go back to your home and think through with family, if you have family back there, a few ideas. So here are a few for you to take home. You've probably heard of the famous paperclip activity, the alternate use test. How many different ways of using a paperclip can I think of? Well, you could try that. Or think of some other household item like a kitchen fork. What other uses could you think of creatively for that? Or as we're getting towards supper time, when you go home tonight, if your cupboard's as bare as mine is at the moment, why not have a creative cooking venture where you set yourself the task of finding 10 different countries represented in your fridge or in tins in whatever cupboard you have, and come up with an imaginative food that blends together food from 10 different countries. You may have a bit of fresh fruit left over, which has come from down the road, in which case there's one of your countries, England, if you're watching this from England. Another really simple thing to do, and we do this in our household, is to think of a tricky question every day and share that, a question that we don't know the answer to. Maybe have some kind of family project around that. And something I particularly enjoy that works well for if you're feeling a weary parent, then or indeed a weary teacher. It's if you've used it already, it's a great way of instilling creative resilience, and it's called Three Before Me. The next time a student or a pupil or a child of yours says, "Can you help me?" or "I'm stuck," you say, "Well, no, go and talk to 3 other people," and they may be children or students or grandparents or whoever, and then come back to me if you're still stuck. It's interesting to me how often learners can unstick themselves given that kind of challenge. So back to my question then, what might we do next? Well, on my to-do list, which I'm passing over to you, is the first thing you might like to do is to think, what am I already doing well? That could be at a personal level, a professional level, a departmental level, a school level, an institutional level, you decide, and bring some of the creative practices together. Second is to have a peek over the wall, to have a look at what others are doing. That could mean a bit of reading. There's a helpful hint there if you want a book to look at, or it could be walking down the corridor virtually or actually to see what other colleagues are doing. And then give it a go. Try something out. Don't necessarily scare yourself by completely redoing your whole term's work, but think about perhaps some taster activities that you could try with a class nearby. And that could well be, and will be probably at the moment, online. You'll see I've left a number of spaces blank there. There's nothing more controlling, is there, than telling anyone what they should do, and there's plenty of space for you to exercise your own creative thinking there. Just 2 more slides now, and then we're done. So I sometimes think that actually what we're talking about here is not a straight line, not the split screen that I was offering you, but it's probably more like a curvy wall. This is a lovely image of a sculpture by Andy Goldsworthy of a dry stone wall in an area of woodland and wetland. And it just somehow weaves majestically its way between the trees and emerges from the lake there. So when you go back to virtually or actually wherever it is you work, maybe we need to be as elegant and cunning sometimes as Andy Goldsworthy was in getting his wall built, and not feeling that we've got to knock things down. If there's one message, it is that this is not an either-or moment. We don't want young people who are good at science and maths and literacy or creative or engineering. We want young people who are very creative and also who love learning English and maths and science and every other subject of the school curriculum. Now, I hope you've got something from that. Do feel free to email me. There is the Expansive Education Network website, lots of stuff there if you want to have a look at it. And there is my Twitter handle and the book series Twitter handle if you're interested. So thank you so much for listening. I'm going to pause there and we'll see if we have some questions.
Great, thank you very much, Bill. Definitely a lot of food for thought there. It's time for questions. So if you have a question, please type it into the questions and comments box. We already have a few. The first one is from John. He's wondering how you feel about the importance of creativity having a positive purpose, because after all, not all creativity has been positive.
This is a good question, and it's a question that I'm often asked, but it's not a problem for creativity alone. The scientist who invented the atomic bomb also invented the ventilators that are saving patients now. So it's not a question. Creativity is not any more or any less morally defined than many of the other great human activities. So I understand where you're coming from. But it's a question that all teachers will have to deal with all the time in making sure that the values by which we're doing anything are the values that we believe to be true.
Thank you. The second one is from Georgina, who works for a project which may see students once or twice a year for 1 hour. So she's asking if there is anything you would recommend for interactions which are brief and infrequent.
Gosh, I think if you only see anyone for once a year, then so I'm going to have to guess that there's some other means of keeping in touch within once a year. I don't know, actually. The people I see once a year, I guess, or in some ways are the people I meet for events once a year in my life, and those could be celebratory events. And I think one thing that works well whenever you see each other occasionally is bringing and sharing something that you'd like to bring and share and offering it up to others in that group. And I'm going to make an assumption here, if it's possible that you've got an ongoing relationship, then there are all sorts of things that can be done. One of the things that we do regularly as part of our expansive education network is that we bring people together virtually. People start off on a research inquiry. They develop their own action plan, and it might be about making their teaching more creative in some way. And then they test things out, and as they go along the way, they share it and they receive feedback. So there needs to be some, unless it's just an annual gathering, there needs to be some ongoing feedback mechanism. And in terms of creativity, I think one of the most helpful ways of structuring any feedback activity is to frame it as a question. And a really creative question for me is framed in the guise, if I do something, will something happen? Because that's inviting the human mind to think what the something that might happen is, and then it's inviting them to think, oh, how might I do that? And very often, how might I do that differently from how I do it at the moment?
Great, thank you. The next question is, do you think there are any significant events in a child's life that can ignite creativity?
Yes, I think that's a really ongoing process. I mean, if we thought from the moment that a child is born onwards, if we use that sort of 0 to much older framework, then when you're very little, everything is joyfully creative because it's the first time that you've done something. So it is kind of truly creative and truly novel. As you develop yourself, you discover that some things give you creative joy, and they tend to be things where variety is possible, or if it's predictability, it's predictable comfort. So if you put your arms up and your mum or dad embraces you, that gives you a warm feeling. So you keep putting up your hands and you keep getting your warm feeling. But if you ask a question and get the same answer, and the same answer gets progressively less interesting, then you start to want to do things differently. I think every new experience in any child's life is an opportunity for their creativity. I think in the home context, and indeed the school context, and this is scary for those of us who are parents and teachers, that one of the things that's most important is actually our own ability to be role models for our children and for those students that we work with. So for example, just a little example, if you really believe in creativity and if you believe in the power of imagination, then it's worth asking yourself how many times in any lesson or in any home day or weekend you're giving opportunities for children to demonstrate their imagination or in inquisitiveness or ability to work with others or ability to practice something and really keep going. So there's something about role modeling and opportunities to learn things. I think there's a great joy, isn't there, when you as you get older, when you meet new people and have new experiences. And there, I think one of the things is about your ability to reflect on that new experience so that you can have a little note to self as to how you can, if it went well, do it again well, and if it didn't go so well, how you can be persistent and creative and make things happen slightly differently. Some people talk of a progressive loss of creativity as you get older, and there is indeed, of course, a sense in which that's true. And sometimes on a bad day in school, secondary school, and colleges, it's possible to feel that one is hemmed in and that the syllabus or the demands of the assessment regime are such that the tasks that you're doing are ever more dull, and that the opportunities that you're affording your young people are ever less creative. And there's a kind of certain sense in which that is probably true. But there's another sense in which as you get older and as you've had more experiences, then, you know, the answer you came up with first is no longer novel. So you have to dig deeper and more subtly and more complexly to get to a different place and to be more creative. This is a tension, I think, in thinking about creativity. The original definition that I shared with you about being original from Ken Robinson is one that has caused lots of us to think. I think the way I frame it is novel according to your context, which means that even a very little child doing something, writing a story, which we all know, a typical story, and then I woke up and it was all a dream, that may be a first time and very creative for that young child. In the greater sense, because it's not creative. Anna Kraft, sadly no longer with us, but a wonderful researcher in creativity, terms this little c creativity. It's the capacity to think a new thought and have a good idea whenever you need it in everyday life. I think that's probably what I think about in answer to, you know, by way of summary to that question.
Thank you. Do you feel there is more resistance to a more creative and personalised approach in schools of higher deprivation?
I think, well, it can go either way. I can think of, interestingly, Rooty Hill High School is a school in what Australia would call an area of high social and economic deprivation. And yet it does the most extraordinary creative things because it has a most extraordinary leader. And I think the school leader is really significant, or college principal is really significant here. So it doesn't follow. I mean, just empirically, it doesn't follow. I can think of all sorts of schools in very challenging circumstances whose answer to the challenging circumstances to be creative. And I can think of other schools whose answer, and there's been a bit of a trend for this, is to kind of be more uniform and to focus on the basics. And I think in some regimes there, it is possible to squeeze quite a lot of what we might think of as being creative out of the diet of young people. I don't think it needs to be like that. And as I hope you heard me earlier on, I don't think binary alternatives are at all helpful here. I think it's really important that we empower young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to get really good at literacy and numeracy, and we empower them to be very imaginative and curious as well.
Thank you. The next question is, do you have any examples of how to fit creativity into subjects that are heavily content-based, for example, science? The person who's asking it, she says that sometimes there is a danger of being too creative and students coming up with the wrong idea of science. So she often feels that she needs to be prescriptive, but is there another way of approaching that?
Great question. I think science actually is the most challenging area at the moment. Looking through the GCSE textbook that my 15-year-olds have. It runs to nearly 1,000 pages, and a lot of it is right, wrong answer, regurgitate on demand, or would have been before we elegantly but rather painfully got rid of GCSEs this year. The answer to your question is yes, it is possible to teach anything creatively, but I think one needs to be realistic and sometimes kind of straight with kids that, you know, hey guys, there is a certain amount of stuff here where there are some right answers that you just need to learn. Now, we can be playful and creative about how we do that, but that aspect of the syllabus is a kind of 1 or 2 mark for a right answer. But much of what, actually even in science, when we're talking about investigation and thinking about application and thinking about real-world utility of science, that does enable creativity. The act of course, experimentation, the word experiment comes from or is so associated with science and is deeply creative. And if you think of the great scientists, they often record that their moments of scientific breakthrough have been in dreams. Or think of the great Archimedes, for goodness sake. He had his eureka moment allegedly in a bath. So I think it is possible to be experimental, playful, project-led, inquiry-led, but I think you have to just temper it with real-world respect for those subjects like science where there's a lot to cover. My personal dream is that we do less better, and I think there's an interesting movement. I was reading a very interesting series of pieces on Twitter today and yesterday about the the curriculum in Finland, which is about to get rid of subjects. That's an interesting idea, probably a radical step too far for many, and definitely for England. So I would encourage my friend, my science teaching friend there, to find small windows in her, I'm sure, very skillful scientific practice where it is possible for young people to exercise their creativity. One little way is the growing use of pre-test. You can have very playful pre-tests and indeed tests of something you've been doing in class. They don't simply have to replicate the kind of way you're going to get asked it in a GCSE or A-level exam question.
Thank you. The next question is related to the significant rise in anxiety and mental health issues in young people in school. Do you know if this has improved in schools that have adopted the models that you shared?
There is a really good literature explaining the relationship between well-being and creativity. And in a sense, the father of this line of thought is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, whose concept of flow you may be familiar with. Flow is that state of absorption in an activity when if the bell goes, you don't hear it. It doesn't happen very often, sadly, in schools, but it often happens in our home life where we're really engaged in something and mum or dad says it's time to go to bed and you say, no, it's not. I want to finish this jigsaw, this whatever it is. So from that literature, we know, because people were invited to describe the activities they were doing when randomly prompted to do so and how happy they were. And we saw there was a direct and positive correlation between doing creative things and feeling better about life. There's another aspect of creativity which we do have good research on and which definitely helps young people, and that's resilience. Resilience and optimism. And interestingly, an all-parliamentary group on social mobility some 4 or 5 years ago, and we reference it in our book, Teaching Creative Thinking, observed that, if you like, the development of creative resilience is another sort of pillar, a bit like literacy and numeracy. We historically think about some young people who are struggling, that they don't have the basics. Well, I think there are some social emotional basics which perhaps we need to think about too. Of course, it's complex, and I think it's utterly unbelievable that you could say a school that is very creative doesn't have unhappy children. It just doesn't work like that. But I think there's some useful literature, there are some practical activities, and the philosophy for children, the mindfulness movement, all have a lot of these elements in their ways of working that the questioner may well be familiar with.
Thank you very much. Now, we do have a few more questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So if your question hasn't been answered, I'm really sorry. Please feel free to email Bill. His email address is still on the screen. So if you could make a note of that and send him an email, I'm sure he would be happy to answer. Thank you very much for joining us today, Bill, and for the presentation and answering all the questions. I'm just about to launch our 3 evaluation questions, so I would be really grateful if you could answer those. The first one is just about to appear on